This is an interview with Jack Cullison for the Kent State University Oral History Project on World War II. It's for History Class 12,071. The interview is being conducted at Jack's home in Warsaw, Ohio on March 26, 1993. My name is Julie Kirker. All right. The first thing I thought we could talk about was maybe you could give me some personal history.
Okay.
About the time before you entered the service.
Okay, I was born in 1925 in Danville, Ohio. Lived on a farm most of my life. My father died when I was 13, and my mother had, after we were renting a farm during the Depression, she scraped up enough money to make a down payment, and we bought a farm. And so I was going to school and farming when the war started.
When you were growing up, did you have any other family members who were in the service?
No. I had an older sister and a younger sister, 4 years younger.
Okay, tell me about when you went into the service. Did you volunteer?
No, I was drafted.
How old were you?
I was 18 in March, graduated from school in May, went and took the exam in July and went into the Army in August. That summer I was working, besides doing farm work, I was driving truck and running a clam shovel at the local sand plant.
Tell me of your training. Where did it take place? And
I was trained in the Field Artillery as a heavy truck driver at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. When we were done with our basic training, they stretched a string across the doorway at 6 feet. And anybody whose hair or head did not touch that string was weeded out, and all those that was that tall or taller were sent to the Mule Pack. Mm-hmm. And everybody that was shorter than that had to go to England, and they were in on the invasion of France. And we who went to the Mule Pack, we thought it was terrible that we had to go to the Mule Pack from driving heavy trucks. But we got 9 more months of training in Oklahoma and Colorado. We were at Camp Carson, Colorado for 9 months and training with mules. The reason they wanted someone to be tall is because a lot of the mules were about 6 feet tall, and you had to be, the pack saddles weighed around 90 to 100 pounds. You had to be able to pick that saddle up and put it over your head and put it on the mule. And if you were taller, it was easier to do. And then we went, had 9 months of training there in the Field Artillery. The 75 millimeter howitzer broke down into 6 or 7 pieces, I forget now, and was hauled on the back of the mules, and all your ammunition and all of your rations and the kitchen and everything was hauled, except your personal backpack you had to carry, but everything else was hauled on the back of mules. And we went from there to California and went on ship. There were about 7,000 of us on this one ship. We traveled by ourselves. We were not in a convoy. And I remember especially one night we awoke and it was just deathly still. The ship had stopped some kind of trouble, and it was a moonlit night, and went up on deck, and it was still. The water was just like glass. And I've often thought that if a submarine had been any ways near us, that we would have been just like target practice. We would have been sitting still, and something was wrong, and they were able to, the sailors that worked on the ship were able to do the repairs, and we were underway again. We went south of Hawaii and went to Australia, stopped for supplies, went south of Australia up through the Indian Ocean to Bombay, India. The first thing you notice when you come into the harbor at Bombay is the odor. It's a very distinctive odor that relates strictly to, mostly Bombay, or mostly India, somewhat to Burma and China, but mostly India. I don't know whether it's all the incense they burn or whether the civilization is so old that just has a distinct odor. They can't get rid of all the sewage. Places that you shop now with, it's not as prevalent now with the goods and clothes and things that come from these countries, but before I'd say the last 10 or 20 years, if something came from India, it had that odor to it. We traveled across the whole countryside of India by train. We traveled maybe 30 or 40 mile an hour, open cars. We would stop at sidings to let trains go the other way, and the kids would just come running by the hundreds, begging for anything that we could give them. My first initiation into the third world. We ended up in Calcutta. We went from there to Myitkyina, Burma. We waited until the mules were shipped in and all of our supplies and equipment. When we were in California before we left the States, we spent about 2 weeks making sure that everyone was completely outfitted with exactly the right size clothes, all winter outfits, all wool, overcoats, long johns, wool shirts, wool pants. Also, we had the gear or the clothes for the tropics. Consequently, we had a duffel bag so heavy you could hardly carry it. When we started down the trail, the first day, all that winter clothes was scattered because we couldn't carry it. It was just scattered all along the trail, and you finally ended up with only the basic things that you absolutely had to have. And that's what you got along with. And we were in Burma. It would rain 2 or 3 times a day. We were in the jungle. We were in the mountains. We would cross the streams. We followed the native trails until our aim was to reach the junction of the Burma Road, where the Japanese had an encampment, and we were supposed to try to drive them, conquer them, and make them retreat south on the old Burma Road, so that the new Burma Road could be finished from India across northern Burma into China. And we were there probably several weeks before we had several pitched battles, very severe battles, a lot of casualties, before the Japanese finally retreated. We followed them, 100 miles down the road, maybe not that far. And a Chinese army came in and relieved us. And we in turn went back to the nearest airfield with all of our equipment and flew it over the Hump into China, which is about 1,000 miles. And it's all mountains, very mountainous, a very dangerous flight path. No airfields, no level ground to land on. Most of this was done in the old DC-3, which was a very rugged, dependable plane. After we were in Kunming a couple of weeks, they those of us who had been on the farm were the ones that worked with the mules. They flew us back over to get the mules, and we started herding the mules to China, to Kunming, China, which was 1,000 miles. We started in May, and we were about 100 miles out of Kunming, China when the war ended. The way there would be about 12 or 15 of us would sort out 200 or 300 mules, and we would start down the road, and you just went out and grabbed one, lassoed one to ride. And of course, we didn't have any equipment, only what was hauled in the truck was the kitchen, and we didn't have to have any heavy equipment or anything with us because it had already been sent to China. So we would herd these mules however far we could go that day, 20 or 25 miles. Then we would stop at a rice paddy and let the mules graze all night. Half of us would stay up half the night, and half the other half of the night to guard the mules. The mules would follow, we always had a mare horse, and the mules would just get in line and follow the horse, like ducks get in line and follow one another. I've been thrown off lots and lots of times. You go out and get a mule, and maybe it'll ride, and maybe it won't. So I got bucked off lots of times. In August, the middle of August, when the war was over, we were 100 miles from Kunming. And we were in a little town, I can't think of the name of it right now, where there was an Air Force signal station that they had for the pilots to follow as they flew over the Hump. And while I was there, I met a fellow that I had gone to school with at Fredericktown before. He was in the Air Force. The Chinese Army, several officers from General Chiang Kai-shek's army came and wanted the mules. Our officers weren't allowed to give them to them. Instead, we took them out in the mountains where there were large gullies. We have to remember there were about 3,000 mules altogether. So there were a lot of mules, but the 200 or 300 that we had, we took them out into the mountains and took them up to the edge of this gully and shot them in the head and rolled them over in the gully. And we got some dynamite from the engineer camps that worked on the road, and we dynamited the sides in on them to bury them. While we were still waiting there, about a few days or a week later, waiting for transportation to move us out of there, we discovered that the native Chinese people were digging those mules up and trying to eat them. And when the stench was just terrible, you couldn't hardly stand it. But we had to go out and get some more dynamite. It was either, I think they figured they had $5,000 in each mule by the time they bought it in the States, shipped it and trained it, shipped it overseas, shipped food and everything for it. I may have my figures mixed up. I have them here in the paper somewhere. It was either 3,000 mules and they had $5,000 invested in it, or it was the other way around. There was 5,000 mules and they had $3,000 invested in it. And then they took us to Kunming, and then we flew from there to Shanghai, China, waited for a ship to take us home, and I was in the MPs then for about 6 weeks, lived at the French Club, which was a huge building on about 20 or 30 acres of ground, much like the White House is here in the United States. We learned to ride motorcycles and become MPs. And we finally were sent home sometime in the before Christmas, sometime in the middle of December. Came into Washington State. across the northern part of the country by railroad to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and was discharged from there in January of 46.
So you were there how long?
I was overseas about 15 months.
What was the name of the branch that you were?
I was in 613th or 613th Field Artillery.
And why did they kill the mules?
Well, I'm not sure because I wasn't an officer to be in on it, but the mules did have a disease, something like malaria, and they just got weaker and weaker and weaker, and finally a few of them started getting this disease, and we had to shoot them. Another reason, as you neared a big enough city in China, you noticed there were no trees anyways near the city because they had all been cut down for firewood. And the little ponies and mules and horses that the Chinese people had, you would see them leading them along just loaded down with this firewood. And I suppose they thought that they would be mistreated because, of course, they wouldn't have oats and stuff shipped from the United States for them, and they would have been mistreated. But you wonder sometimes of all the friction that was between the different groups in China at that time. The communists were trying to take over, and Chiang Kai-shek was fighting with different elements in his army. Evidently, someone decided that they shouldn't get this help, and so they didn't get them. Before we got into battle in Burma, one other story, we traveled through these mountains on these native trails, and there was no way to get supplies into us. So every 3 days we got an airdrop, and we had to be at a certain place every third day so that the Air Force would know where to drop supplies, and they would drop them on a rice paddy, and they would come by parachute in. They would just pile the stuff up in the door and fly around about 400 or 500 feet high, just make big circles around the mountain, and they'd push the supplies out as they came over the rice paddy, and a lot of it would break open, but a lot of it the parachutes worked. One day we didn't get our supplies because there were Japanese Zeros in the area, and we had to go 3 days without any rations, or with very low rations. And we traded cigarettes and de-rationed chocolate bars to the natives for rice. And then at night, when we stopped, we'd try to cook it. And you could cook it for 2 or 3 hours, just boil it and boil it and boil it. It wasn't whole, and it would never get soft. It was real, but at least it kept us alive. One time, our officers decided that we needed some more to eat, and they approached a native farmer and took his water buffalo and shot it and killed it. And we all had we had water buffalo to eat for a day or two. Of course, it had to be cooked and everything right then because there was no way to preserve it. But I've often thought they gathered up all the Chinese money or Burmese money that they had and gave to him. But you wonder, here's this farmer, and this is his way of making a living and tilling his ground, and it takes years to grow one large enough to do this and train it. And this army just comes along and takes it. The native people in Burma lived so primitive. It was just pitiful. just the coarsest of clothes and bamboo huts and shacks. We did come up on this one large bamboo building one time, and we stopped and looked inside, and it was it was probably 20 by 30, maybe size of a building, and across one whole end of it was this huge Buddha with all of the jewels and everything, and seemed so out of place out in the jungle there inside of that bamboo hut. And some of the soldiers, they went up and tried to chip the jewels off of it and damaged it, defaced it.
While you were there, did you have any contact back home? Were you able to get mail?
Mail was very limited coming in, and we couldn't send anything out. There's no way to send anything out for probably 6 weeks, maybe.
So did you know what was happening with the rest of the war?
Not too much, no. If someone was injured, I remember one fellow was injured while we were on this trail hike before we got into the battle, and we had to break the dikes and level off a couple rice paddies, enough that they could get a little Piper Cub plane in to get this, and the plane almost crashed landing and taking off because it's such a narrow, short landing distance. But they were able to get him out. And then when they did have made a landing field where we got into combat, and it was in the valley that was closed in on 3 sides, and they could only land and take off one way. And the first time that the general came in, his plane cracked up. And of course, it was about stopped before it run out of runway, but it still cracked up, and he couldn't fly out till another plane came in and got him. The treatment of the native people was terrible. When we were in China, we were in one part of China in these barracks. A couple of the soldiers had gone out and accosted a couple native women, and they took them down and gave them a shower and brought them into the barracks, and were passing them around one night. And you talk about the rape and pillage of all the other armies, but the American Army was responsible for some too. This is Camp Carson, Colorado, and I had seen the mountains in the east here, the Smokies, but I had never seen the Rockies. And they moved us in there by night, by train, and to Camp Carson. And when we woke up, it was a real bright, sunny morning there at Colorado Springs, and we looked out of the train, and there was the mountains standing right straight up on one side, and here you looked east, and it was just flat, right straight out across the plains. These are some of the things, pictures of training that we had there in the mountains, and some of the officers and so forth. Letter to my sister. Suyang, China was where that Air Force buddy was. And also another fellow I met there was Dean Farmer, a boy I'd gone to school with at Howard. Also at that place was another, at that same town, we noticed this elderly, gray-haired white person, Caucasian, wandering around the village, and we got to talking with her, and she was a missionary who had been there, I don't know, 40 or 50 or 60 years, and she had come in there by horseback, and she had lived all of her life in that village. And this is the way the natives, they took a pole and strung their wood on it. You see there's no trees or anything anyways close around. You can see here how they loaded the poor animals down. Here they are again. One thing I did neglect to tell you, when we were moving the mules from Burma to China, we were on the portion of the old Burma Road that was in China. And the engineers had built a bridge across the, I think, the Irrawaddy River. And it had a load limit, say, of 50 tons. We had all 200 of our mules on there at the same time. If they weighed 1,000 pounds apiece, that would have been 100 tons. And when I was in Shanghai, China, I went to the International Christian Church, and while I was there, they said during service, if any of you would like to go out to dinner with some Chinese people afterwards, any of the soldiers were there, just to wait out in front. So I waited out in front, and this gentleman came up and invited 3 or 4 of us to go to dinner at his home. And he had turned out that he was a former ambassador from China to Great Britain. And he had 2 teenage daughters, and his wife looked like she was about 30 or 35, but the Chinese women that were in the elite, wealthy group never had to do anything for themselves but take care of themselves. And she was, I guess, in her 50s. And she was just a beautiful, outstanding, beautiful woman. This is the French club this is the top of the French club where we were staying. You can see the bars on it painted camouflage, but you can see what a tremendous, here it is, a picture of it here. What a huge building it was. While we were there for 6 weeks, there were all kind of white Russians and refugees from Europe, and beautiful, beautiful women, beautiful girls, white Caucasians, and the guys just went crazy after those girls. And there was one little kid that kept hanging around our barracks all the time. He was a real super intelligent little kid. So I got acquainted with him, and he was interested in all kind of electronics and music and theater and everything. So right close by was the Lyceum Theater, and I said if I would pay the way and we would go to the opera if he would explain it to me, if he would translate it for me. So we went to see The King Richard by William Shakespeare, and it was all in Chinese, but he had lived there long enough to interpret it for me. Now then, this is a book that was written of our exploits, and that's the Chindit War by Stilwell, if you want to get it out of the library. We were a part of what they called the Mars Task Force. And I have all these articles here, and I'll let you read them. Okay. While visiting in Florida this winter, I saw in the paper where the veterans of the CBI Theater were having a meeting, and we had other plans for that day, but it was near our line of travel. And we stopped and made ourselves known, and possibly if we're there another year, we'll be able to join them.
Thank you very much for doing the interview.
You're welcome, Julie.